Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be doing another Monster Hunter piece. I got commissioned to do Xeno'jiiva, so I figured I would do a tutorial on it and show you guys how to do it as well. Anyways, let's get started. So I think one of the hardest things about actually having this commission was that it was a lot smaller than my other Monster Hunter pieces that I've done. They wanted it to be closer to about 12 inches long, which is kind of the smallest I'll do unless we go very unrealistic, and they wanted a lot of detail. So when you make things that are a little bit smaller, you gotta cram that detail into that piece. You really have to try and squeeze every little bit of detail into such a tiny little workspace. Now, some people are really good at doing that, making miniatures and really super tiny things, but that is really not my forte. I am a lot better at just kind of more on the average size of what a plush creature would be. So going smaller is definitely a challenge for me. But I really enjoyed actually doing this piece. The sculpting for it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing all the multiple eyes that kind of go up the length of the head. I actually really like artwork that does that, where if you pick a pair of eyes, the facial expression kind of changes and then you just look at it a different way. And I just really like that type of artwork, and I was really happy that I got to do a piece that had that in it. I really should do more pieces like this where the facial expression is very different and kind of morphs and changes depending on how you look at it. I believe I've only done like one other piece. I believe it was our lava salamander, and that was kind of a while ago. Another surprising thing that made this piece a little bit more difficult was actually trying to find good reference photos. Most of the time when I get commissioned to do a Monster Hunter creature, there's just tons of reference pieces on the internet. You just Google the name, you find them in Google Images. But this one, for some weird reason, I just had a very hard time finding really good reference photos that matched what it looked like in game. I think I ended up using reference photos of a sculpture of it, and then a few fan art pieces that looked very similar to what it looked like in game, and then of course game art itself. But normally I have no trouble at all finding really good reference photos. So I thought that was kind of odd, especially with this piece. Anyways, once I had all the eyes laid out along with the mouth and the nostrils, and also a few different spikes and stuff at the base of the head, I started adding a bit of a scaling texture to try and finish it off. Again, trying to get as much detail in this piece as possible. And then for baking the clay head, I put it in the oven for about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then for working on the clay feet, these weren't really too much of a challenge. I mean, they were very basic dragon feet. The only thing different is normally I leave my toes a little bit flatter, but with a lot of the art I found that the toes were more curled or crinkled up a little bit, so I made my wireframe a little bit more bent and just tried to emulate that shape when I was making these feet. So I kind of changed up the basic shape of how I usually do my dragon feet. Other than that, putting them together was pretty much the same. I started by adding the claws, doing pre-bakes and things like that, working on the bottom of the foot, then working on the tops of the feet. The only major difference with the tops of the feet is I decided to go and do the scaling a little bit differently. The toes, I kept it the same where I normally layer the clay to make the scales. So I took little balls of clay and I layered them going up the toe. I did break these up a little bit so it looked like there was more scales, but the rest of the foot I ended up kind of layering a nice smooth bit of clay there and then sculpting in the texture of the scales. So I did it a little bit differently just because I didn't want to have the base of the foot too bulky. Now, the sculpting for all of the feet was extremely similar, so I'm not going to go over how I did the difference between the front and back. The main difference with them was the front feet had thumbs, so the back feet, obviously, you're not going to have thumbs. That was basically the only difference between the front and back. So once I got all my clay feet done, I put them in the oven as well. Same baking time and temperature, 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once all of our clay pieces were done baking, I started on the painting. Now, for the painting, obviously the main color is going to be white, but there's a lot of like blue and different highlights and stuff that are in this piece. So I found the best way to get all those blues in there was to try and put it into the cracks of the scales first. So what I'm basically doing is I'm taking the blue that I want to use, I'm painting over the entire surface of my clay face, trying to get the paint into all the cracks and crevices and stuff like that. And then really quickly before my paint dries, I'm taking a damp paper towel and wiping away the paint from the more raised surface where we're going to end up painting it white. Normally when I do this technique, I'm using black to try and add shadow and depth into a scale texture, but again, this time around, we're using more of a blue color. Now, if you're going to do something similar to this, I recommend doing it in sections because acrylic paint dries pretty fast, so what I ended up doing was picking one side of the face, painting it, wiping it away, then doing another side until I had all four of the sides done. So that way none of the paint dried and we didn't have trouble wiping anything away. Anyways, I let that dry and then I went over the entire piece with my white paint. This time I didn't paint it like when I did the blue, I went over it lightly, so I only got the white paint on the more raised part of the clay. I let that dry and then I ended up moving on to adding detail to the face. So I started adding a bit more color to it. So if I felt like it was too white, I added a little bit more blue to the white and just kind of adjusted the colors and then moved on to more finer detail, like painting the horns and fading them into the body, and then of course painting those eyes that really red color. And then the painting for the feet was really simple. I did that same technique with the blue paint in all the cracks and then painting over everything with white. And then the only major detail was painting the claws a nice black color. So I got the painting done for all four of the feet and the face, and then I let everything dry, I resined over it, and since we're going to let these sit and cure overnight, I'm going to start on the sewing. Now the sewing for this piece isn't really much different than doing any basic dragon body with 4 legs and a pair of wings. So the pattern for this was pretty simple, pretty basic, there really wasn't anything special about it. I did change the shape of the wing just slightly because it did have more of a jagged edge at the end, so I wanted to make it look very similar to that. So I'm going to start with the main body sewing first. I have a left and a right, and then I also have a belly piece. And I'm going to sew all 3 of these pieces together to make one body piece. And then the legs are really simple too. Each one has an inside portion and an outside portion. You just sandwich these together and then you sew the fronts. We're leaving the backs open for when we put everything together, so don't sew that just yet. And then for sewing wings, I find it easier to not cut your fabric out first to get the sewing done first. So I have a piece of fabric that's folded over on itself, so we have a top and a bottom, and I have the pattern shape of our wings drawn out on one side. I pin my fabric together and then I'm just going to take my sewing machine and sew along these lines. And then once I have the shape sewn, I'm then going to cut out my wings. It just makes it a lot easier because of how large the wings are to just sew them like this first. Anyways, that's really all the sewing that you have to do before we start putting everything together. So I'm going to start assembling our doll. So basically, since we're already working on the wings, I'm going to continue putting them together and then we'll put the body together. So for the wings, they have their own wireframe. I tend to leave that wireframe separate until we put everything together. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking the fabric for the wings, I'm sliding it over the wire for the wings, and then with those little finger wires that we have for the wings, I'm going to take some needle and thread and I'm going to sew those in place inside of the wings. That way they don't kind of float around and move and the wings are kind of held together a little bit more. This part is a little time consuming because you do want to take your time and kind of hide all the different seams that you're sewing. Also, I highly recommend using a very similar color thread to the fabric that you're using. It just makes it a lot easier to hide where you sewed everything together. And then once I have the wings put together on the wireframe, I'm then going to take that and I'm going to add it to the wireframe for the body. So I'm just going to connect them right around the base of the body, the very middle portion, and wrap them together with a thinner wire. Then I'm going to take the fabric for the body, I'm going to lay it out, and I'm going to use the wireframe as a guide to figure out where the wires for the legs are going to need to stick out. So then I'm just going to cut some little holes, and then I'm going to run those wires through the fabric. That way the fabric for the body is over our wireframe. I'm then going to take our clay head and we're going to glue this to the end of the wire for the neck. Then I'm going to take the fabric for the neck and I'm going to start gluing this around the base of the head. I'm also taking a strip of fabric that's going to be for the back of our dragon, and that's going to be glued at the very base of the head at the top. I'm going to let all that dry, and then we can start sewing and closing up our body. So I'm going to start with the neck, and then once we get to where the wings are, I'm going to start sewing the fabric to connect it to the wings. While I'm sewing the body closed, I'm also stuffing it as I go, so when I got the neck done, I did that. I stuffed the body after we got the wings done, and I continued doing this until we got to the end of the tail. Now with this body, I wanted to try something a little bit different. I wanted to shape it a little bit, so I decided to start using my needle and thread and kind of tuck the fabric and pull it in and just kind of alter the shape of it a little bit so it didn't look so flat. One thing I do recommend if you're going to start kind of messing around with the shape of the body after it's put together is to not fully stuff the body, to leave it a little bit loose. Not where it's saggy or anything like that, but where you have a little bit of room to kind of pull in the fabric so it's not so tight. So I just messed around with the shape. I just kind of kept adding stitches here and there to change the shape of the neck. I mainly did the neck and the tail just because it was bothering me the way they looked. And then after that I moved on to adding the legs. So I'm going to start with the front legs and then we'll add the back legs. So I'm just going to take the fabric for the legs, I'm going to sew it in place around where the wire for that leg is, and then I'm going to connect our clay leg to the wire frame. Once I have that in place, I can glue our fabric around the base of it, stuff, and close up the back of the leg. So again, I added both of the front legs and then I moved on to adding the back legs, and these were done pretty much the same way. So once I've added all 4 of the legs, I'm then going to move on to adding our final details. So I'm going to move on to adding the details to the end of the tail. I just want to add a little bit of more fabric there, change up the shape of it to match our reference a little bit better. While working on this, I realized I wanted to add a bit more scaling to the body. So while I was messing with the tail, I realized I really wanted to add some felt pieces to it. So I did the same thing to the back legs, and I just kind of messed around with adding scaling here and there throughout the body, just so it didn't look so flat. I also added some felt pieces and a little bit of fur fabric around the base of the neck. And then after that, I want to mess around with the basic color of the body. It's just way too white, and I want to make it look like it has that blue glow like we did with the rest of the clay pieces. So I'm going to start using my paints and a little bit of my fabric markers and just kind of add those colors to the body. Now I don't want to cover up the white, but I do want to add hints of colors every now and again to the body so it looks more like it's glowing. Oh, and after I got the painting done, I realized I forgot to add the claws to the tips of the wings, so I really quickly added those to the ends of the wings. Okay guys, and here is our finished piece. I had so much fun with this project and I can't wait to send it off to its new owner. Now like I said, this piece is not for sale, but I have a bunch of other art dolls on my Etsy shop, so if anyone is interested in buying them, go ahead and check the links down below. I also have links to a bunch of different art supplies that I like to use to make my art dolls, so if you're interested in trying it out yourself, check those links out. They are affiliated links, so they do also help support the channel. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!